In 1872, at Dundas Street in Broughty Ferry, there lived a family called Lorimer. Their home was a small apartment in which John, a fisherman, his wife, Jessie Scott, and their 5 children lived. Even though Lorimer was working, the pay was low, and much of his wages was spent on drink rather than on food and clothing for the family. The relationship between Lorimer and his wife was tempestuous, and neighbours frequently heard drunken rows between the pair. A few years earlier, on Friday 1st October 1869, Lorimer had stood trial before Sheriff John Guthrie Smith in Dundee, accused of assaulting his wife. The previous month, his neighbour, Mrs. Anne Malloch, had witnessed Jessie, who had been using insulting language towards him as he'd approached his home, being dragged through the adjoining passage into her house. Both Lorimer and Jessie were drunk, and he was screaming at her, asking where his supper was. He pulled her onto the floor, continued Mrs. Malloch, the baby under her. Mrs. Malloch then picked up the baby and placed the child in a cot. Lorimer then picked up a bait spade and said, "I'll split your skull with it," placing it on his wife's head, but Mrs. Malloch took it from him, and he never used it. She left, but as she peeped through the window, she watched as he threw a drawer from the dresser at Jessie, then another. Both hit her, causing her nose to bleed. As she lay on the floor, Lorimer put his foot on her head and said he'd crush it. Later, when Mrs. Malloch was in bed, she heard the cry of murder and Jessie's daughters saying that she was bleeding and should she go and get her grandmother. Following more witness testimonies, the judge said he had no choice but to find Lorimer guilty of the assault. But he believed that this was not an ordinary case of wife-beating. The evidence provided a terrible picture of family life, but no matter how much his wife had provoked him, Lorimer should not have used violence. It was his first conviction of assault, although he had been charged along with his wife 2 years earlier of breach of the peace. And taking the domestic situation into account, the sheriff was lenient in his passing of the sentence. Lorimer was ordered to keep the peace for 6 months, under penalty of a £2 fine, and if he failed to pay it, 20 days in jail. By 1872, the fisherman had had enough. On 4th June that year, Lorimer went to sea on the East Indiaman called Mangalore from Dundee. It is unknown whether he returned to the squalor he'd left. The following day, Jessie was seen loitering at her door in a state that shocked ferry folk. She wore the remains of a gown, was bare-legged and barefoot, but wore nothing else. People who saw her had never seen anyone like that on a public street and were horrified at the state of her. However, her house was in a worse condition. Inside were her 5 children, ranging in age from 8 months to 13 years, most of them naked. The eldest, a girl, also called Jessie, had part of her dress covering her, but nothing else, as she held the baby in her arms, as she sat on a box. The baby had only what could be described as a flannel around its shoulders, but the 3 middle children were completely naked. It transpired neighbours had taken pity on the family, handing in money, food, and clothing for the children, but Jessie sold these clothes to pay for her drink, it was believed. It appears she also sold much of the furniture. The only furnishings were an old rickety and broken kitchen dresser in one corner of the room. There was no bed, only shavings and rubbish in a corner, and a pile of fishing net was a substitute for blankets and sheets. This was in a recess, and the second recess appeared to have the same. The third had a small closet. The effluvia emanating from the closet was overwhelming, and the smell from here escaped through a broken window, making passers-by feel nauseous. As for crockery and cooking utensils, there was one broken goblet, a bowl, a cup, and a spoon. But it was also noted there was no food in the house whatsoever. When the police entered the house following Jessie's arrest by Sergeant Davidson for being drunk and disorderly on the Wednesday night, the children darted into corners and the recesses to try and hide, as they were so frightened of strangers. This wasn't the first time Jessie had been arrested. She had been convicted at least twice before, at the sheriff court for being drunk and disorderly, and that night she was also charged with indecent exposure of her being due to lack of her clothing. The children were described as emaciated, weak and sickly looking, and when asked if they'd had any food, they told the police they'd had some potatoes for dinner and bread and tea for breakfast. Witnesses said the children had been living like this for the past 6 months, and it was revealed that none had ever been to school. All of the children shivered as they tried to stay warm. The house itself was filthy. From the outside it was run down, and the solitary window with its 2 broken panes was thick with grime. Dirt was everywhere, and the stench was overpowering. The floor in the room consisted of broken flagstone, the kind used for pavements, and was covered in thick slime. The walls were described as destitute of the slightest appearance of colour, and of course they weren't hidden by using furnishings, which made them stand out even more. A newspaper reporter who visited the house wrote that the house and family were in as deplorable a state of filth and wretchedness as could be imagined. The Inspector of the Poor was asked to make provision for the children after Jessie was sentenced to 30 days imprisonment. As already stated, the eldest was 13 and the baby 8 months. The other children were aged 4, 7 and 9. There were many who questioned what would happen following her release, not only to her children, but to Jessie as well. With their father at sea, there was no telling when, or even if, he'd return. Jessie's convictions for being drunk and disorderly continued. In 1873 she was charged with breach of the peace in Dundas Street and pleaded guilty, but she promised to rejoin the Good Templars, so was admonished and dismissed. In January 1874 she was before magistrates again, having forfeited a pledge of 5 shillings for being drunk and disorderly once more.